A letter from a laid-off factory worker became the spark that ignited the most-watched White House interview in decades. But it was Stephen Colbert's quiet, 8-word question that left a president completely speechless. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, the clip of the final, deafeningly silent 30 seconds was everywhere. It wasn't just replayed on cable news. It was looped on social media, turned into memes, and analyzed frame by frame by body language experts. News anchors, usually so quick to fill the air with commentary, seemed momentarily stunned, often just playing the clip again with a simple, "Wow." The internet didn't need a hashtag. It had a title, a name that became a symbol overnight. The Nobody from Ohio. Across the political spectrum, the reaction was not one of partisan rage, but of a collective, sharp intake of breath at the raw, undeniable power of what had just happened. In the White House press room, aides scrambled, phones rang unanswered, and a carefully constructed narrative for the week had been completely demolished by a single, handwritten letter. 3 days earlier, the mood in the West Wing had been one of supreme confidence. President Donald Trump sat in the Oval Office, not behind the resolute desk, but in one of the plush armchairs, listening as his press secretary, a sharp-suited man named Trent Holloway, ran through the week's media schedule. The Colbert interview was presented as the final piece of a strategic puzzle.
"Sir, this is a golden opportunity," Trent said, pacing slightly. "We've been hitting the official channels hard with the tariff wins, the America Strong initiative. This lets you do a victory lap in their territory. You go in, you're charming, you take a few of his little jokes, you look presidential.
You're speaking directly to an audience that thinks you're a monster. We can peel off a few points just by showing up and being reasonable." President Trump waved a dismissive hand. "Colbert's a clown, a lightweight, always looks like he's about to cry. You really think his audience is gettable?" "It's not about getting them, sir. It's about looking like you're willing to try," Trent countered smoothly. "It projects strength. You're not afraid to walk into the lion's den. We control the location, we control the timing. He's on your turf. The visuals alone are a win. You, magnanimous in the most powerful room in the world, listening to a late-night host. It's perfect."
The president leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips.
I like the sound of that. Magnanimous. He envisioned the headlines. He saw it as a simple power play. Another episode in the grand show of his presidency, where he was, as always, the star. The idea that Stephen Colbert, a man he considered little more than a court jester for the liberal elite, could pose any genuine threat was laughable. The meeting concluded with Trump giving a firm nod. "All right, set it up. But tell his people, no cheap shots, keep it respectful." Miles away, in a cluttered writer's room in Manhattan, the atmosphere was entirely different. Stephen Colbert sat at a large table, littered with coffee cups, scripts, and laptops. The energy was a mix of creative buzz and caffeine-fueled exhaustion. They were brainstorming a segment, tossing out jokes about a recent political gaffe. Colbert was laughing, batting ideas back and forth, when a young intern named Finn hesitantly approached him.
"Mr. Colbert? Sorry to interrupt."
"This came in the viewer mail," Finn said, holding out a single, thin envelope. It's handwritten." Seemed important. Usually, such letters were filtered through a half-dozen layers of producers and assistants. But Finn was new, and something about the neat, careful cursive on the envelope had caught his eye. Colbert, intrigued by the departure from protocol, took the letter to him. He unfolded 2 pages of simple, lined notebook paper. The other writers quieted down, sensing a shift in their boss's demeanor as he began to read. He read it to himself first, his expression slowly changing from casual curiosity to one of intense focus. The slight, default smile he wore in repose vanished. He looked up at his head writer, Jess Pineda, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had been with him for years.
"Listen to this," he said, and his voice was different.
The performer was gone. This was just Stephen. He began to read aloud.
"Dear Mr. Colbert, my name is Leland Vance. I'm writing to you from Defiance, Ohio. My wife, Darlene, and I have been watching you for years, first on the old show and now on the new one. You make us laugh, and lately, that's been in short supply." Colbert paused, looking at Jess. "He's got a good opening," he continued. "I don't know who else to write to. I feel like no one is listening. For 25 years, I worked at the Defiance Bearing Corporation. I made ball bearings. Good ones. I was proud of my work. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the mortgage, it put food on the table, and we were going to send our daughter, Kira, to community college this fall so she could become a nurse. 25 years. I have a pin to prove it." The room was silent now. The comedy writers, masters of irony and cynicism, were listening with rapt attention to a story devoid of any punchline. Then the new tariffs came in. We were told they would protect us, protect our jobs, make America strong. I believed it. I voted for it. Then our company got hit. The cost of the specialized steel we had to import went through the roof. A few months ago, they called a meeting. The whole plant. They said they were restructuring. Last month, they closed our division, moved it south of the border where the steel was cheaper. I got a severance package that barely covers 3 months of bills. My pension is gone. Darlene is looking for work, but there isn't much. Kira's college fund, that's gone too. She's working at the diner now, trying to save up. Colbert's voice was low, steady. He wasn't performing it. He was just reading the words on the page. "What I don't understand is how this was supposed to help. I'm not writing this because I'm angry. I'm just tired. And I'm confused. I did everything right. I worked hard. I paid my taxes. I believed the people in charge. And now I feel like a ghost in my own town. The president is coming on your show, I saw. I know you'll make jokes, and that's fine. But could you ask him? Just ask him what guys like me are supposed to do now. Where do we go? Sincerely, Leland Vance." When he finished, Colbert carefully folded the letter and placed it on the table. The silence in the room was thick, with unspoken emotion. No one was reaching for a joke. "My God," Jess whispered. Colbert looked at her, his eyes clear and determined. "Cancel the monologue we had planned for the White House interview." "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking this is the interview," he said, tapping the letter. "Not the talking points. Not the political horse race. This man. Leland Vance from Defiance, Ohio." He turned to his main producer. "Find him. See if this is real. If it is, I want you to ask him and his family if they would be willing to fly to D.C. with us." The producer looked worried. "To put them on camera? The White House would never clear it. It's a huge security risk, and they'll say we're setting them up." "No," Colbert said firmly, his voice cutting through any potential argument. "They don't go on camera. They are not a prop. They don't even have to be in the room. This isn't a stunt. I just want them to be there. This is about making sure that when I ask the question, I'm not just reading a letter. I'm speaking for a real person. This is just about the truth." The decision was made. The next 2 days were a blur of logistics. The Vance family was located. They were, as Leland's letter suggested, a quiet, proud family, initially wary of the offer. They weren't looking for a spectacle, but Colbert spoke to Leland himself on the phone, and his sincerity won him over. He promised them their privacy would be protected. They wouldn't be paraded in front of cameras. They would simply be his guests. They agreed. On the day of the interview, Colbert and his small crew arrived at the White House. The Vance family, Leland, his wife Darlene, and their 18-year-old daughter Kira, had been brought in through a separate entrance and were waiting in a small, discreet office in the East Wing, looked after by one of Colbert's most trusted producers. They were nervous, dressed in their Sunday best, looking around with a sense of awe and disbelief. Colbert met them there before he went to the Oval Office. He shook Leland's hand. It was a strong, calloused hand. "Thank you for trusting me," Colbert said simply. Just ask the question, Mr. Colbert," Leland said, his voice trembling slightly. "That's all I want." Colbert nodded, a deep sense of responsibility settling over him. He left them there and was escorted by Trent Holloway to the Oval Office. The cameras were in place. The lights were hot. President Trump was already seated, beaming with confidence. "Stephen, welcome to my house," the president boomed, gesturing expansively. "Mr. President, thank you for having me," Colbert said, taking his seat.
"It's a lovely home. Do you get to keep any of the furniture when you leave?" The president laughed, a loud, barking sound. The interview had begun. For the first 20 minutes, it went exactly as Trent Holloway had planned. Colbert lobbed a few gentle, satirical questions. Trump answered them with practiced ease, staying on message, projecting an image of a powerful but good-humored leader. He talked about the stock market. He talked about his rallies. He was in his element, dominating the conversation. He was winning. Then, Colbert's posture shifted. He leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more serious. The playful glint in his eye was gone. "Mr. President, I want to talk about the real-world effects of some of your economic policies," he began. "Specifically, the tariffs that were designed to protect American industry." Trump nodded, sensing a predictable line of attack. "They're a tremendous success, Stephen. A total success. We're bringing jobs back. Everyone knows it." "Well," Colbert said, reaching into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, "I received a letter this week I'd like to share with you." He unfolded the 2 pages of lined paper. The camera zoomed in slightly. The president's smile tightened. This wasn't part of the script. Colbert began to read Leland Vance's letter. He read it slowly, with deliberate clarity, his voice filling the most powerful room in the world with a story of quiet desperation. He read about the 25-year pin, the lost pension, the daughter who could no longer go to college. As he read, the president's confident facade began to crack. His legs started to jiggle. He shifted in his seat, his eyes darting from Colbert to the cameras and back again. This was not a statistic. It was a story, with a name and a hometown. When Colbert finished, he folded the letter and looked at the president, waiting. The silence stretched for a moment. President Trump forced a scoffing laugh, trying to regain control. "Oh, come on, Stephen. You don't really believe that, do you? Where did you get that? From the DNC, Central Casting?" He leaned forward, pointing a finger. "Frankly, Stephen, it sounds made up. And even if it's real, he's a nobody. Us." The word hung in the air, sharp and brutal. "One person," Trump continued, warming to his own argument, feeling he had found his footing. "We're talking about the big picture. We're making the country great. You can't get bogged down by every nobody with a sad story." The silence that followed was unlike any other. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the hot lights and the faint hum of the cameras. In that moment, the Oval Office, a room designed for declarations of power, became a vacuum. President Trump's face was a frozen mask of shock and fury. His mouth, which had been opened to continue his tirade, hung slightly agape. His eyes, for the first time in the interview, were not defiant, but lost. They darted toward his press secretary, Trent Holloway, who stood just out of the camera's frame, his face ashen, his own bravado having evaporated instantly. Stephen Colbert did not smile. He did not lean in for the kill. He simply held the president's gaze, his own expression one of solemn patience. The air crackled with what was unsaid. The crew, seasoned professionals trained to be invisible, were stone still. The lead cameraman held the tight shot on the president's face, instinctively knowing that this was the only image that mattered. Finally, after an eternity that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, Colbert spoke again, his voice still quiet, devoid of any triumph. It was the voice of a man completing a task. "Sir, that nobody and his family are here today." He let the words land. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The implication was a thunderclap in the silent room. The challenge was laid bare. Say it to his face. The president's mind seemed to be racing, cycling through 1,000 possible responses, and finding none of them viable. To lash out would be to attack a blue-collar family in front of the world. To apologize would be to admit defeat to a man he despised. To ignore it would be an act of cowardice so profound it would be undeniable. And so, he did nothing. He sat, pinned to his chair by 8 simple words. Colbert slowly, deliberately, put the folded letter back into his jacket pocket.
He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to his producer. It was the signal. "Thank you for your time, Mr. President," Colbert said, his voice returning to a formal, broadcast tone. He began to unclip his lavalier microphone. The gesture broke the spell. The True, jolted back into action, began to move with quiet efficiency, preparing to wrap the shoot. The sound of a cable being coiled, a lens cap being snapped on, was jarringly loud in the tense room. President Trump finally found his voice, but it was a strained, reedy version of his usual bellow. "That was a cheap shot, Colbert. A real ambush." Colbert paused, microphone in hand. He looked at the president, not with anger, but with something that looked almost like pity. "With all due respect, sir," he said, his voice low enough that it was unlikely the boom mics picked it up. "I just read a man's letter. You were the one who called him a nobody." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the Oval Office, his team following in his wake. They were met in the hallway by a frantic-looking Trent Holloway. "What the hell was that, Stephen? We had an agreement. Respectful." Colbert didn't break stride. "I respected a citizen of this country," he said, walking past him. "You should try it sometime." They were escorted out of the White House in a blur. The usual post-interview pleasantries were gone, replaced by the stony glares of White House aides. The moment they were inside their black SUV, Colbert's producer, Jess Pineda, finally let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking as she looked at her phone. "Stephen," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Oh my God, Stephen." She turned the screen towards him. It was already everywhere. The clip, posted by a news reporter who had been watching a live feed, had millions of views. The headline on the Drudge Report was a single, stark phrase: the silence. On Twitter, the words "that nobody" were a vertical rocket, the #1 trend in the world. Back in their Washington, D.C. hotel suite, which had become a makeshift command center, the team watched the fallout on television. Every channel was showing it. They cut away from regularly scheduled programming. On one network, a panel of political analysts was speechless. One of them, a veteran conservative commentator, just kept shaking his head, muttering, "Unbelievable! He walked right into it." On another, a liberal host was emotional. "This wasn't about politics," she said, her voice thick. "This was about decency, plain and simple." The adrenaline that had carried Colbert through the interview and the tense exit began to drain away, leaving behind a profound and bone-deep weariness. While his team buzzed around the room, ordering food and fielding frantic calls from the network, he slipped into the adjoining bedroom and closed the door. He sank into an armchair, the city lights of D.C. twinkling outside the window. He loosened his tie and stared at the patterned wallpaper, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears. He hadn't felt this way since his early days in comedy, the terrifying, exhilarating emptiness after a risky improv set had either soared or crashed. But this was different. The stakes were immeasurably higher. He hadn't just been playing a character or telling jokes. He had held up a mirror to the most powerful man on the planet, and the reflection had been ugly and undeniable. The weight of it, the responsibility he had carried for Leland Vance and his family, settled on him like a physical burden. He pulled out his phone and dialed his wife, Evie. She answered on the first ring. "Stephen." Her voice was taut with worry. "Hey, honey, it's me." "I saw it," she said, her voice a mix of awe and terror. "Stephen, what have you done?" It wasn't an accusation. It was the sound of a person who knew her husband, knew his core, and also knew the world they lived in. It was a question about consequences. "I read a man's letter," he said softly, repeating his line from the White House hallway. "I know. It was one of the most powerful things I've ever seen," she said, and he could hear her take a shaky breath. "But the things they're saying online already, the comments, they're calling you every name in the book. They're posting our address, the threats." He closed his eyes. He had known this was coming. It was the price of admission in the modern world for an act like this. "Are you and the kids okay?" "We're fine. "We're fine for now," she said. "I'm just worried about you. This isn't like a monologue, Stephen. This was different. This was personal. He's not going to let this go." "I know," he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "But I had to. When I read that letter, Evie, I didn't have a choice."
It felt like the whole reason I had this stupid show is to be able to do something like that. Just once. They talked for a few more minutes, her voice a lifeline of sanity in the swirling chaos of the evening. When he hung up, he felt the profound loneliness of his position. He had a team, a network, a loving family, but in the end, he was the one who had sat in that chair, who had looked that man in the eye, and who would now have to bear the full force of the storm he had unleashed. The next few days were a relentless media hurricane. The White House came out swinging. Trent Holloway held a press conference where he called the interview a disgrace and a highly manipulative, pre-planned political stunt. He announced that the Vance family had been tricked and exploited by a liberal entertainer for ratings. Pro-Trump media outlets ran with the narrative, painting Colbert as a villain and the Vances as unwitting pawns. They dug into Leland Vance's life, trying to find anything they could to discredit him. A traffic ticket from 1998, a stray political comment on a neighbor's Facebook page. The country was split down the middle. To half, Colbert was a hero who had spoken truth to power. To the other half, he was a smug elitist who had ambushed their president. The debate raged, loud and furious, on every screen. Colbert stayed silent, canceling his next two shows to let the storm rage without his adding to it. He felt the story was slipping away, being buried under the usual partisan sludge. Then, on the third day, the narrative shifted. It didn't come from a politician or a rival network. It came in the form of an op-ed published in the Wall Street Journal. The author was General Alastair Finch, a retired four-star general, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man universally respected for his quiet integrity and his determinedly apolitical stance. He was a figure of unimpeachable character, a hero to the very conservatives who were defending the president. The title of his piece was simple: On Listening. The op-ed didn't mention Stephen Colbert's name once. It didn't have to. General Finch wrote, "I have spent 40 years in service to this country, leading soldiers in peacetime and in war. I learned very early that the strength of a unit is not measured by the volume of its orders, but by the attention it pays to the quietest voice in the ranks. An officer who does not know the names of his soldiers is a manager, not a leader. An officer who does not know their stories, their struggles, and their families is a liability." The piece continued, its prose as crisp and unadorned as a dress uniform. "In the civic life of our republic, this principle holds even truer. A citizen's plea is not an interruption of the national business. It is the purpose of it. To listen to a constituent is not a chore. It is the fundamental duty of an elected official. A leader who cannot listen to the quiet voice of a single citizen, who dismisses their story as an inconvenience, has forgotten the first and most sacred principle of command. Every soldier, every citizen, has a name and a story. To dismiss one is to declare your unfitness to lead them all." This recent incident in the national spotlight was not about politics, ideology, or ratings. It was about a failure of character, a lapse in the basic decency required of anyone who holds the profound trust of the American people. The op-ed landed with the force of an artillery shell. It was unassailable. It cut through the political noise and reframed the entire event. It gave permission for people who had been privately appalled but publicly silent to speak up. Now, conservative talk show hosts couldn't just attack Colbert. They had to contend with the words of a revered general. The next White House press briefing was a bloodbath. Trent Holloway was barraged with questions. "Mr. Holloway, does the president believe General Finch is also part of a liberal stunt? Does the president have a response to General Finch's assertion that he displayed a failure of character? Will the president apologize to the Vance family?" Trent had no answers. He stammered, he deflected, he attacked the media. But the damage was done. The story was no longer Trump versus Colbert. It was now Trump versus dignity. And the president was losing.
A week after the interview, Stephen Colbert walked onto the stage of the Ed Sullivan Theater. The applause that greeted him was different from the usual pre-show hype. It was a roar, a tidal wave of sound that was less about celebrity worship and more about a profound, shared sense of release and validation. It went on and on, a standing ovation that refused to die. Colbert stood at his mark, not with his usual wry smirk, but with a look of genuine humility, his hand over his heart, nodding his thanks. He had to gesture several times for the audience to quiet down before he could even begin. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, the jokey, high-energy cadence of his typical monologue replaced by a somber gravitas. "Thank you," he said, the words heartfelt. "Thank you all very much. Please, have a seat. It's good to be back." He paused, letting the weight of the last week settle in the room. "As you may know, I took a little trip down to Washington last week, and it got a little more attention than we expected." A wave of knowing laughter rippled through the audience. "I'm not going to show the clip," he continued, holding up a hand. "I think we've all seen it enough. And I'm not going to relitigate the interview. The President of the United States and his team have had their say. A lot of other people have had their say. Tonight, I just want to have mine. And then, if it's okay with all of you, I'd like to get back to telling jokes about squirrels on water skis." He walked from his monologue mark to the edge of the stage, closer to the audience, breaking the usual format. "A lot has been written about what happened, but for me the most important words came from General Alastair Finch, a man I have never met, but for whom I, and I believe our country, have the deepest respect." He didn't need to explain who the general was. In the past few days, the man's face and his words had become almost as famous as the interview itself. The general's op-ed didn't mention my name, and I'm grateful for that, because this was never about me. He wrote about leadership and duty and the responsibility to listen, and he recentered the conversation on the one person who actually mattered in all of this, the person we should have been talking about all along. Colbert's eyes found the main camera, the small red light indicating he was live to millions. His expression was stripped of all artifice. It was just him. This was never about a gotcha moment. It wasn't about a clever question or a political victory. It wasn't about me, and it shouldn't be about the president. It was about a man named Leland Vance, a man from Defiance, Ohio, who loves his country, who worked at the same factory for 25 years, who did everything he was ever told was the right thing, and who just wanted to know why his life had been turned upside down. His letter wasn't an attack. It was a plea to be seen. He took a slow breath, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate. "We live in a time of so much noise. Everyone is shouting. Pundits, politicians, people on the internet. We're all shouting to be heard. But maybe the most important question we can ask those in power isn't, are you winning? Or whose side are you on? Maybe the most important question is the one Leland Vance was asking in his letter. The question so many people in this country are asking every single day when they get up and go to work or look for work, when they pay their bills, when they worry about their kids. The question is simply, do you see us? That's it. That's the whole thing. Do you see us?" He let the question hang in the air. The theater was utterly silent. "Thank you for letting me say that," he finished, his voice returning to a more normal volume. "We'll be right back." He walked over to his desk, and the audience, after a moment of stunned silence, erupted in applause once more, this time with a deeper understanding of what they had witnessed. The media storm was over. The principle had been established. 3 weeks after the White House interview, in a small, fluorescent-lit room in the Defiance Community Center, Leland Vance stood nervously behind a rickety lectern. The room was filled with about 50 people, men and women, young and old, all with the same weary but resolute look in their eyes. They were his former co-workers, his neighbors, people from the next town over who had lost their jobs at the glass factory. A local news camera was set up in the back. Leland smoothed a single, creased piece of paper on the lectern. His hands, which for a quarter of a century had expertly handled industrial machinery, trembled slightly. He was not a public speaker.
He was a man who preferred to do his job and go home to his family. But the man who had written a desperate letter in the quiet of his kitchen was gone. In his place stood someone new. "Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming," he began, his voice a little shaky. "Most of you know me. My name is Leland Vance." He took a deep breath. "A few weeks ago I felt invisible. I felt like everything I had worked for, everything this town was built on, had just vanished overnight. And nobody in charge seemed to notice or care. I felt like a ghost." He looked up from his paper, making eye contact with the people in the room. He saw his own story reflected in their faces. "So I did something I never thought I'd do. I wrote a letter. I was scared to write it. I thought, who am I? Who's going to listen to me? I felt like one person's voice couldn't possibly make a difference." He paused, a small, sad smile on his face. "Turns out, I was kind of wrong about that." A few people chuckled. A woman in the front row nodded emphatically. "What happened after that?" Leland continued, his voice growing stronger. "It wasn't really about me. It showed me that one small voice can make a big noise. Not because I'm special, but because my story is your story. And your story is his story." He gestured to the man next to him. "And hers. They heard me because I was telling all of our stories at once. So we can't stop there. We can't wait for someone else to come and tell our story for us. We have to tell it ourselves. That's why we're here. We're starting a group. Some of us have been talking. And we're calling it the Defiance Action Network. It's simple. We're going to help each other with resumes. We're going to share job listings. We're going to make sure that if someone's power is about to be shut off, we all chip in to help. We are going to make sure that no one in this community feels invisible ever again." In the front row, his daughter, Kira, held up her phone, recording her father. A proud, tearful smile lit up her face. The diner uniform she had been forced to wear was a reminder of what they had almost lost. But the look in her eyes was one of pure, unadulterated hope for the future. The local news camera slowly pulled back, capturing the scene. Not a rally of angry protesters, but a quiet, determined gathering of neighbors. A community, fractured by economic hardship, beginning to stitch itself back together, not by a government program or a corporate handout, but by the simple, powerful act of seeing one another. The lasting echo of one man's question had become their answer. In a world full of noise, what does it truly take for one quiet voice to be heard? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that go beyond the headlines.